this is from Luke chapter 18, by the way. To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I'll tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Right. Last time I spoke here, I spoke about examining yourselves. I want to continue that theme, and I want to look at this morning, I want to look at the theme of humble yourselves. So the verse from 1 Peter 5 verse 6, which says, humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he might lift you up in due time. You know, one of the problems in talking about humility is I'm so good at it. I promise the humour will get a little better as we go through. You know, the first thing I did when I looked at this topic of humility, I said, I want to look at when Jesus was humble. I want to look at a couple of instances where Jesus was humble, and what can we learn from that? What do I take away from that? And so I started by looking at the passage of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, because there's a sense there of that whole servanthood and humility. And I thought, not sure. And I looked at the passage that Paul writes in Philippians about the Christ coming to earth, becoming a man, although he was going to become a man, so that he could die on the cross and he could save mankind. I'm thinking, no, I don't know. I don't know. So then I looked at the passage of the wedding in Canaan, at the very beginning of the start of Jesus' ministry. And I asked myself the question, you know, just so we know the one, that's the one where he turns water into wine, very beginning of what he was, of his ministry. And I asked myself, why did Jesus go to this wedding? Well, it certainly wasn't to preach a sermon, because he doesn't preach a sermon. He didn't particularly give any wise words at this particular wedding. And it's not because he's a celebrity or that he claims to be famous, so they've invited him. Why does he go? Well, he doesn't go as the Son of God, even. He goes to this wedding because he's invited to go. He just goes because he's invited. He doesn't go there to be famous or to in fact, the miracle that he performs there, he performs reluctantly and doesn't make any particular knowledge around in the wedding community there that he's actually performed this miracle. He goes because he's invited. He is the Son of God, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, going to a wedding simply because he's invited. There's a humbleness for me in that. The other story that I looked at in terms of Jesus' life was the one that happened in between his death and resurrection and his ascension into heaven. So here is the Son of God who has died, who has rose again to take away the sins of the world. He's in that space from doing that to the ascension into heaven and sitting at the right hand of the Father and going back to his rightful place in heaven. He's in the midst of that. And what do we find him doing at one point? Cooking breakfast for the team. I think it's fish from memory. This man who is God's son, who is the King of Kings, cooks breakfast for the team. The humbleness of this man. And as I think of him in those two instances, I begin to get a sense of the humbleness of him, but it humbles me to see this person who is the King of Kings just being ordinary. Just being ordinary. There's a humbling sense in that for me. The other thing that begins to humble me is that sense of that God chooses us to work with him in ministry. We're all called to some form of ministry. We're all called to do some works for God. We all play our part in the kingdom growth, whether it be big, small, formal, informal, whatever it looks like, we're all called to do something. It's humbling to think how God uses us. There's three ways that we can do that ministry with God. Let me tell you the first way. I want to tell you a joke. So I'm giving you the heads up that when I finish this, if you could laugh politely, that would be nice. Thank you. I haven't finished yet. There's a young pastor. Spent 3 years at college. He spent 3 years, comes from a poor family, lives in a rented apartment, doesn't have lots of money, obviously. He meets a rich girl. Comes from a rich family, really rich family, and they fall in love. So there's this rich girl coming from a rich family and this pastor who's poor, who comes from a poor family. They fall in love and they decide that they're going to get married. So the pastor, this poor pastor, goes to the father and says to the father, I want to marry your daughter. And father says to the pastor, but let me explain something to you. My daughter's used to having all that effectively she desires. How will you provide for her? And the young pastor simply says, God will provide. So the father goes on and says, look, she's used to living in a pretty big house. And you're living in a rented apartment at the moment. How will you provide for her in terms of housing? And the young pastor says, God will provide. And so the father goes on and says, look, at some point you'll have children, effectively my grandchildren. How will you provide for their education? How will you bring them up? How will you provide for them? And the young pastor simply looks at the father and says, God will provide. And the father says, just hang on, I'm going to go and talk to my wife. So the father goes out, chats to his wife, and his wife says, so how's it going? The father says, look, he's a young boy, he hasn't got lots of money, but it's a little odd how he keeps calling me God. But you see, we can have this scenario where we just think God does everything. That we sit passively back and we don't do anything other than let God do his work. We don't get involved. We don't do anything. The other alternative is that we believe that God is passive, that we do everything, that God just simply looks down. Occasionally, he might do a small work, but generally it's all up to us, that we do all of that work. All the ministry work that we're called to do, we do it ourselves. If anything happens, it's because we've done it. Now, most of us, I suspect, think that it's somewhere in between that. It's what I call the loaf of bread ministry. You see, God doesn't provide trees where loaves of bread grow on, as far as I know. He doesn't provide. He could, if he so choose, but he doesn't choose to. What he does is he provides the resources, he provides the intelligence for us to be able to make loaves of bread. So he provides, we do some work.
It helps that when we need it.
It does. Absolutely. So there's this sense that we partner with God. Can I say, I don't think God partners with us, I think we partner with God. Which is exciting, but it's also humbling to think that God uses us to bring about what he desires. It's humbling to consider and to think about. I've got a question for us to think about that I'm going to answer. I'm going to give the answer as part of when we look at the passage that Chris read to us earlier. I'm not going to give you the answer, but I think you'll work it out as we go. When a person tells lies, we call them a liar. So the act of telling lies means that effectively you are a liar. Does doing acts of humility therefore make you a humble person? Is it the same? We looked at the passage in Luke chapter 18. Parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Let me set the picture here. And as we launch into this, can I give you, it feels a bit like you have at the beginning of TV programs. Some of the things that are going to happen shortly may disturb you, may make you feel uncomfortable. As I looked at this story, it actually made me feel a little uncomfortable. So I wanted to give you a warning. It might make you feel uncomfortable as we move forward. Let me set the scene. Jesus, can we have just the first slide up so that we've got that passage in front of us? Thank you. So what we read first up is two men go to the temple. Two men come into church. That's how the story starts. Nothing remarkable about that. Nothing special going on here. Just two men going up to the temple, going into church. And then Jesus reframes that a little bit. He gets people starting to think, okay, so one of them is a Pharisee, maybe a church elder in today's terms. He's going up to the church to pray. The other one is a tax collector. Maybe a drug-dealing bikie is the equivalent. Something similar today. So we've got a drug-dealing bikie here, and we've got the elder of the church over there. Both go up to pray. Both have come to meet with God, or at least we think so. Both have come to pray. Reminds me a little bit of the prodigal son story. So here you've got the drug-dealing bikie who's discovered that the life that he's living is not the life that he wants to continue living. He knows that he's done a whole lot of wrong things, needs to put them right, needs to get right with God. And then you've got the older brother over here who's saying stuff like, well, I've always done all the right things. I've always done the church stuff. Always been there. You know the thing that made me feel a little uncomfortable when I started thinking about this story? Was that I've always thought of myself as the older brother. I've never really drifted distantly from God and had to come back. Thought of myself as the older brother. Anyway, so the prayer of the Pharisee, or the prayer of the church elder, we're kind of thinking at this point, who's going to pray the best? Who's going to do the best prayer? Well, church elder knows what to say, lives a pretty good life, can use all the terminology, knows what the big words mean. The drug dealing Mikey, well, his prayer's not going to be that good, is it? So, but we know from the story that Jesus wants to focus on the tax collector's prayer. That's the one that connects with God. So what's the Pharisee's prayer? Where does he miss the mark? Can we have the next slide? I want you to count in that prayer how many times in just 2 sentences does the Pharisee use the word I? It's 5. Or at least it was in the version that I read. But it took at least a number of times. 2 in that instance. In the NIV, it's actually 5 times that he uses the word I in those 2 sentences. Use the words I. The other thing that he does in this particular prayer is that he puts other people down and exalts himself. And exalts himself. So going back to the question about the lies and then makes you a liar, I want to share with you something a little tongue-in-cheek, if I may. And I'm saying that deliberately. Because one of the things that we could think from this particular passage is that if we want to pray correctly, what we have to do is that we have to go some distance away. First of all, go to the temple, to the church, and then we distance ourselves. And then what we need to do to really impress God with our prayers is we've got to beat our chest, because that's what the tax collector did. And whatever we do, we can't look up because the passage says there that he kept looking down. And one of the words that he uses is I'm a sinner. So if we want to impress God with our prayers, we just need to do that. Pretty simple, isn't it? Now we know that that's not true. Just the actions themselves are not going to be what it is that impresses God. What impresses God here is the humbleness of the man's heart, of him understanding God's love for him. I can't remember whether this particular story came out of International China Concern or not. It's 4 or 5 years ago at least that I heard this particular story, but I want to share it with you because it brings together the things that we've been talking about. A woman young girl turns 18 and she writes in her diary, "I am humbled by the love that my parents have for me." This child wasn't adopted till she was 8 years old. She had a disability. She couldn't talk English. She came with a whole range, because she'd been in the orphanage, because she'd been rejected. She came with a whole range of particular problems, challenges. But these parents turned up from America, looked at this girl and said, "We want to adopt you because we love you." Despite all the difficulties, despite all the challenges that was going to present. And that's what they did. And it did present some challenges as they moved forward. But she got to the age of 18 and she wrote in a diary, "I'm humbled by the love that these parents have for me, despite who I am, despite my history, despite the challenges I've caused them. They've loved me." And she was humbled by it. It got me thinking that I'm adopted by God. And He adopts me despite the hassles and the problems that I bring and the history I have and the things that I've done. He adopts me all the same. And it humbles me to think of that. Definition of humbleness. Now, I haven't checked this out with any great theologians. This is what I've made up, which is always a little risky. Definition of humbleness that I came to as part of putting this together is an awareness of our forgiveness, intention with our awareness of our sinfulness. In fact, you can split it around the other way, that it could be an awareness of our sinfulness, intention with an awareness of how much we're forgiven. It's humbling to think that God forgives us. Can we have the final page? Second part of verse 14 says, "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." So there's two camps. You're either one or the other. You're either exalting yourself, that is saying, "I don't need God," or you're humbling yourself and saying, "I have a need for God's forgiveness." There is no in between in that. So what happens to those who exalt themselves? God's going to humble them. What happens to those who humble themselves? God will exalt them. Like He does here in the front part of this verse, where it says, "I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified," that is, right with God. Why? Because he understood his sinfulness, but he also understood how great God's love was for him. I tell you, this man, this drug dealing bikie who has come to an awareness of his sinfulness and knows to put it right, he needs to come to a loving God. This man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Let me pray. Lord, we thank you that we are forgiven. Lord, we acknowledge before you that the things that we do are not always the right things. not always the things that we should be doing. But your love, your grace towards us, Lord, yells out to us that you've adopted us as your children. Despite who we are, despite our history, despite the things that we've done, despite how we see ourselves, you love us. You care about us. And Lord, we thank you for that love. We thank you, Lord, that it's in that love that we can humble ourselves. In the knowledge that your grace is sufficient for us. Amen.